Thank you, Sydney.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Arden O'Connor, and I'm the founder of O'Connor Professional Group. I'm lucky enough to work with Diana and Sydney at a company that deals with some serious issues. You can see at the bottom of the slide that we deal with addiction, mental health, eating disorders, and autism spectrum disorder. And I have to say that I'm very excited today to talk about something that's a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more general in subject matter, and that's how we are going to survive this summer and maintain sanity during a pandemic. And I hate to do a spoiler alert, but I'm going to just tell everyone on the call today that we are not presuming that we have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination. Diana and I work well together, and we talked a little bit about ways that we think families could potentially think about a framework for the summer that will help their shift in attitude and help to think about resources that might be helpful for their families. But I don't by any stretch of the imagination want people to think we have the magic bullet, because if we did have that, we would all be in a much better position. So I'm going to open up with just a question to start off the call. And I do really hope that as things progress sort of towards the end of our content session, people will pop up with questions. But Diana, why is this such a big issue now? Why is there such fear among friends, colleagues, and our clients around this particular summer, making it through and having the right answers or the right resources?
That's a great question. And I was talking to my sister about particularly that question. She has a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old and lives in a city without a yard. And I thought, wow, she is the perfect person to discuss this issue with. And she really honed in for me that not only are the activities during COVID at this particular time indoors at most situations, and even beyond that it requires attention for parents. So even the virtual things that we can recommend require more parental attention than they used to. So families are used to having their kids go to camp, have a million and myriad activities. And this quote puts it back 50, 60 years. David Lacey had this in his book. We grew up in an era when parents had the attitude that as long as the kids are healthy and decently put together and seem to be okay, leave them alone, they'll turn out fine. And that is basically how I grew up. My dad was a doctor, and in essence, when you complained to him about an injury or something that hurt, his attitude was, if it hurts bad enough, it'll fall off. And I remember feeling like, okay, I'm not being heard here. That being said, I did realize that most of my amusement was going to have to come from my own resources. So today, as this quote goes on, turning out just fine is not a satisfactory objective for middle and upper middle class parents today. The kids have to be optimized. They must achieve everything they're capable of achieving. That's a hell of a burden to put on kids and the parents. It's unrealistic. And it's particularly unrealistic this summer. If we could take everybody off the hook and start talking about what is possible, what is in fact, and we're going to talk about it in a few slides, good enough this summer, we're going to be miles ahead of people who are simply trying to continue on as if we aren't in entirely different circumstances. So as Scott Peck used to say in his book, The Road Less Traveled, in the very first sentence, life is difficult. We are going to have to adopt life is difficult and figure out some strategies to address that. Another historical perspective slide is prior to the last half of the 20th century, parents were really insulated by the belief that it was the child's obligation to demonstrate his or her worth to the parent, not the other way around. You rarely heard parents talking to kids, does this make you happy? Would you like this chocolate or would you like dark chocolate? That didn't go on in grocery stores. It really didn't. It was up to us to prove that we were getting good grades, that we were doing our chores, that we were worthy in some ways. And I'm not saying that was the best approach for many of my peers' mental health in sense of self-achievement and sense of self, but it really was a perspective that balanced out whose job is it to be demonstrating worth. We cannot create worth for another person. Only the individual who is trying to promote worthiness can do that. So a modern perspective, if we look at this, is being a good parent today means being sensitive to our kids' complaints in ways that would have been unheard of in prior generations. And while the sensitivity increases the potential for closer, more fulfilling relationships, it also increases the chance that the parent will be made to feel inadequate, shamed, or guilty in the process. When my son was born, and I am a late in life mom, and so he is only 19, I would go to these parent groups and I would feel like not only a messenger from a different planet, because I did grow up a generation different from many of the moms, but I also felt like we were all trying to hustle around for worth. I made the best baby food. I have figured out the best, in those days it was language program for pre-verbal children. And how do we optimize? How do we make our kids feel happy? And I realized pretty young when I had a couple of older line teachers who took me aside and said, it doesn't work, Diana. It simply doesn't work. We can listen to our kids, but we still need to be leading them in the approach. So, and wanting kids to be personally fulfilled, that means happy and passionate and joyous and have all of the things we genuinely do want for our kids. It's unique to this generation. Having gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it, it's no surprise that kids grow up expecting us to provide it for them and give up responsibility for finding it themselves. And I had an incredibly on-point conversation with my son, who is probably still in bed, whose freshman year was interrupted. And I said to him, and I've been talking about this for weeks, what is your plan to pursue passion and purpose and meaning this summer? What are you going to achieve? And the look of blankness on his face actually alarmed me. And I had to go about and say, okay, perhaps that question was a little bit much, despite the fact that you really did do well in college. Why don't you think about what ways you can placate your mother for the summer? Because if that's the only thing we're going to get out of this summer, I am okay with it, because it is time, and I am beating the drum right now, to return to good enough parenting. Good enough parenting was born, that quote was born by Donald Winnicott, and he was a psychiatrist, philosopher, and pediatrician in the 1940s and 50s and 60s in post-war England. And what he recognized was that kids whose parents weren't able to meet every single need and fill in every single gap, and actually allowed their children to be angry with them for those gaps, did better than the kids who didn't. They adjusted to reality better when their parents allowed them access to the idea that they couldn't fix everything. So this quote by Susan Goldberg basically says it up. I'll just say it. I'm not here to make my children's lives magical. I'm here to feed, clothe, and love them. And I'm also here to provide them with some opportunities for learning, growth, and fun. I'm also here to support them, part of which involves stepping back and letting them try and sometimes fail and hopefully try again on their own. But magic is not in the job description. So if you are one of those parents who has always felt like summer was a magical time, and it can be, because some of our childhood memories were magical. Let's leave the magic to the kids. Let's live the beginning part of this quote: feed, clothe, love them, provide them with some opportunities, but give them birth to discover their own sense of magic. So Arden, what are your thoughts about what we just talked about? I know you love charts. This kind of graph makes me dizzy. How do you see it?
Well, we were trying to figure out, I think what you've said is right on. And I do think it gets to kind of three components that we think about when we talk about surviving the summer. And the first one you've hit on, which is a shift in attitude. You know, when I think about what you've said, I think the last quote particularly for me resonates around accepting that, you know, it's not necessarily parents' jobs to provide a magical experience. And if there were a summer that might not have the same magic than prior summers did, it's probably this summer, because parents aren't going to be able to control whether they can have the same vacation experiences they did before. They're not going to be able to control whether the movie theaters reopen and whether the amusement parks reopen. So to me, a lot of what you've described is really accepting reality, that this summer might be a summer that we don't have exactly the same experiences, but it doesn't necessarily mean we aren't going to learn something. I loved your quote about good enough parenting. Can you give us and the participants on the phone some examples of what that might look like this summer?
Well, I can talk about meal preparation. In many houses, families are now together for 3 meals a day at, you know, day in and day out. I would surrender. I would shift the attitude that I, as the mother, felt like it was my job to provide all 3, if possible. But I would also look at, you know, what are the simple things we do that are perfectionistic? Do we use good china at every meal that requires hand washing? We may need to adjust that and use paper plates. We may have to look at the ways, you know, what outside activities don't require a whole lot of people. A mud puddle for young kids may be just as fascinating as going to a park. Look at what's around us and say, maybe this will have to just be good enough.
It makes total sense. I guess one other question I have is, so if we think about the shift of attitude, good enough parenting, accepting reality, and trying to determine, really what I'm hearing is, if you broaden the issue away from food, sort of determining in your family system what is essential to have and what is a nice to have. So what are those things that are really increasing the connections amongst your family system? And what are things that are nice, but maybe creating a lot more logistical challenges that may just not be feasible? And I'm thinking particularly of those families with 2 parents at home, both of whom are trying to work remotely and have children that need help. And that sort of brings us into the next segment of this, which is, how do you develop a system that will work with your family? So when we've gotten a lot of questions from our clients, what are the best systems to have in place? Is it a checklist system where we have a group of chores or various activities children have to choose from? I had one parent say to me, I'm thinking about running a summer boot camp for my 4 sons, where they have to get up and do push-ups part of the day, and they have to do chores, and then they're allowed to go to their activities. Other families have said, you know, do I have to create a schedule which each hour is planned? Do you have an opinion, Diana, as to which of this is optimal? And is there a way to get kids buy-in? Like, how do you think about providing enough structure that it's supportive without creating an undue burden on parents to do so?
So it does depend on the constellation of the family. If there are 5 kids and 1 single parent, developing a system is going to be different, because you are going to need to account for all the chores of the family. If somebody is a single child and you've got 2 working parents, or maybe 1 non-working parent, there's going to be a lot more available time of parents. So we first need to account for the availability of the parents. Excuse me, 1 sec. Slideshow. I don't know what happened. Yeah. So here we go. There we go. All right, I feel better. The chart feels better. Thank you, Arden. So it does depend on the constellation of the family. Some families can dedicate way more time to enforcing structure. Some families need to just say, in a good enough way, here are the chores that need to get today. The first one up gets to pick two, the next one up picks two, and the next one up picks two, and I'll take over the last two. That's a system. Another system is listing out the weekly chores and the daily chores, and have a lottery system for who gets to pick which chores of that week. But it's really important that what has to get done be borne by everybody, because this family system, we have known now with parents working and kids at home and trying to get them to school, that two parents trying to do everything without including kids in the conversation has been less than thrilling for most families. So I would start with a family conversation. Little kids are even capable of having a family conversation. You can do it like a legislative meeting. You can do it like a courtroom. You can do it like a board of directors. There's a million ways to do it. You can do it like a group of superheroes. Just have a family conversation about the idea that everything has to get done. But people get a say in some ways about how it gets done and who does it. So have that conversation.
And am I right to assume, Diana, even with small children, things that they want control over, screen time comes to mind, what chores they have to do, what time they have to go to bed, even older children around curfews. We're increasingly seeing families where they have somebody who got furloughed from work. So now all of a sudden a 24-year-old is moving back home, and all of the boundaries that had never had to been in place for the past 3 years now have to be reinstated. Am I right to assume that regardless of young children versus older children, having them have conversations about even things that are a little bit more arduous, maybe even what consequences they may have if they break the rules or if they don't fulfill what they've committed to, has an impact on whether or not they buy in?
Absolutely. And you know what? Most kids are harder on the punishment consequence side than the parents would be. You know, when I used to ask my son, what should be the consequence when you violate the no computer rule after 10 o'clock p.m.? And he'd say, well, I guess I shouldn't be able to use the computer the next day. And I was like, oh, okay. Because what my thought was, shave 10 minutes off the next day. He made a much more onerous consequence than I potentially would have.
I think that's really helpful. And I'm going to just say a few words on the last sort of bucket in this very beautiful triangle slide. Thank you for getting it back on the full screen. I was joking, laughing to myself, good enough presenting. So working together, and it takes a village. I mean, I think one of the things we're seeing with some families is that the opportunity to have domestic help, whether that is an au pair, a nanny, a babysitter, you know, some of that is still exists and some of it has been changed given sort of the COVID rules and families' level of comfort with having someone else in the home and not necessarily knowing their personal habits. I think one of the areas that I've seen that was really interesting, there was an NPR article written recently about the relative low risk of families thinking about expanding their bubble and quarantining together. So especially for those families where you have two working parents, you get a broader spectrum of a group who can help to organize some of the activities we're going to get into later. But the other creative solution that I heard another client mention is actually, you know, one of their family members, their older sibling, one of the older siblings in a sibling group, couldn't be a summer camp counselor because the camp experience was actually canceled for the summer. So they actually decided to pay the older sibling almost the way they would have been paid at camp to help organize activities on behalf of the younger folks and help to do some of the things, not take over parenting completely, but at least have some flexibility during working hours where someone else was in charge of saying, okay, now it's time to exercise, and helping with meal prep, helping to kind of structure the day. And the last thing, and I think this is, we've been on, as you know, many employer webinars recently. I think all companies right now, and importantly so, are very concerned about employee mental health. How are they balancing the pandemic, some of the racial incidents that have happened across our country? We've had an increase of requests of employers asking, how can we support the mental health situations of our employees? And one of the areas that we're talking about is a more flexible work schedule and being sensitive to employees' needs. So I do think that it's an opportune time that if you're looking at your family schedule for the summer and saying, geez, I could work 4 days and get the work of 5 days in, or I could truncate my schedule and work from 10 to 2, and my partner could provide support in the early morning or in the evening. It may give some additional options that perhaps wouldn't have been there prior to COVID. But I am hearing an increased attitude of flexibility because employers want to keep good people and want to be supportive of those employees who've put in time and make sure that they're offering the resources that they can.
I think that's right. I'm hearing a lot of flexibility from employers, and I'm hearing a lot of parents who heretofore hadn't been navigating domestic chores very well, doing a better job of splitting that up and including the kids. There was a book that was out by Lancy, Lancy, and he wrote this book called Raising Children. And he is an anthropologist, but what he talked about was that the ways we have protected our kids, like if we see a child with a knife, we take the knife away as opposed to getting them a practice dull knife. And this may be the summer to instill them with more competencies because they're going to be around us this summer. It may not be so much the summer of fun, but it may be a summer where they get competent at taking care of a sister or brother, at practicing writing for postcards for grandma and grandpa. They may get more competent, and that will increase their sense of self-efficacy, frankly.
I think that sounds great. So now we're going to get to the beach philosophy and the components. And, I think these are very self-explanatory, but I'll run through kind of our thinking on them, and then we'll talk about some actual practical activities. And those on the webinar should know we're going to actually circulate a PDF with resources and links for you to review. We thought we'd go through some high-level stuff on the call, take some questions, and then also provide you with some additional details that you can peruse. But I think, I think the philosophy that we were thinking about, Diana, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the importance of balance this summer. Bonding both with family members and with friends. I do think for those families that we see that have managed to sort through the chaos, one of the things that they are saying is a silver lining of COVID is if they had traveled a lot previously, they're not traveling anymore for work at least, and they're able to be home and spend quality time with kids. And I think the same thing, we're hearing a lot of parents who are concerned about having those same opportunities for kids to have that with their peers, with their cousins of the same age. And I think one benefit of the summer months, especially here in the Northeast where it's chilly, is that as the weather warms, a lot of the activities that previously would have been more complicated to do in colder months will become opportunities you can take advantage of now. I think that brings us into exercise. We certainly know that dopamine levels are raised through exercise. I am not a parent, but I have a 6 and an 8-year-old nephew, both 2 nephews who are lovely. And I will say the worst case scenario is the rainy July day where everyone has been trapped in the house. And now it will be exacerbated if we can't take them to the bowling alley or the video arcade or something to amuse themselves. So I think finding creative Amazon videos to exercise, but getting outdoors as much as possible for children and young adults is very important. So we'll talk about some creative ideas in that department. Altruism, I think for me as a child, I was very blessed to be raised in a home where altruism was something my parents didn't just preach, but they really practiced, both in giving financially, but also giving of time. My mom volunteered at homeless shelters all throughout my middle school and high school years. When I was in college, she was volunteering once a week at a boys' school where she cooked a meal, and I would go with her, as would my brothers, and served a meal to a bunch of inner city boys, probably about 40 kids. Obviously, some of the more in-person opportunities have gone away, but I think there are plenty of creative things, whether it's making packages at home, writing letters to support causes. There's a whole bunch of websites that are in the PDF that talk about virtual online experiences. And I honestly believe, I think for children and young adults, I think, one of the things I think is a concern for a lot of parents is they're going to, my kids are so disappointed by everything we're not able to do. And I think that the value of altruism is it gets people thinking beyond their immediate world and what are they losing, but also helps them think about how can they contribute to those who might even have less than them? How can they contribute in a time when there are people not sad that they can't go to their summer home in Cape Cod, or they can't go to camp the way they had hoped, but they really are concerned because their mother doesn't have enough food to put on the table. So I think it's a great area for families to think about incorporating activities. Contribution sounds very similar. It worked with our beach mentality, but I think this we really meant is a contribution in the home. And you've talked about a couple of examples of that, Diana. Chores, I know for me, I will be the first one to embarrassingly raise my hand to say I didn't learn how to do laundry until I was in college. And so had the pandemic hit when I was in high school, one valuable activity I could have learned is how to make some basic meals, not Julia Child meals, but just basic cooking strategies and how to do my own laundry. And then hobbies, really interests that people can take up. I've heard, and we'll get into some more of these in a minute, but everything from families who say, our son always wanted a drum set. We never wanted one. This is the summer we're getting one. To families who say we bought an ice cream maker and we're spending a couple of days, a week with kids learning how to make ice cream for our family and really taking the time, not just to add another toy or appliance to our cadre of other things, but learning as a family how to do something. Or that older sibling is guiding their younger siblings into doing something that the kids have interest in.
That's great. So let's talk about the bonding piece for just a minute from the neuroscience perspective. This is where I get a little geeky. So it's my thing. I have been studying the neuroscience of bonding. So Arden mentioned dopamine, and when people connect, dopamine, our internal joy and euphoria creating chemical, definitely elevates. But even more than that, our oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter hormone and magic chemical that we produce, increases bonding and decreases anxiety. So as oxytocin elevates, cortisol, our stress hormone, decreases. And so bonding can look as simple as gazing, even in a screen eye to eye. I don't recommend it because then you're also looking at yourself, for 90 seconds, not 90 minutes. A bonding, elevating, petting a cat elevates oxytocin. Writing secret messages and slipping them under somebody's door elevates oxytocin. Random acts of kindness and love. All of those things elevate oxytocin. And don't forget that it isn't just that we're bonding, we're having fun. It is when we're doing that, we are decreasing our brain's availability of stress chemicals. So go ahead with the bonding. Most of these slides are parent and child, and that is probably very realistic for the summer. But as Arden mentioned earlier, we really are hoping that families will be able to expand their bubble, share their availability with kids who have kids similar ages.
I've heard a couple of families who have used the bonding activity to be, one woman I know, a mom created an interactive scavenger hunt for her neighborhood. So for her children and other children in the neighborhood, where she said, on this street, how many owls did you find? How many streets in our neighborhood start with the letter C? And she had all these various activities, and it was a way, and they actually virtually celebrated, who found the most activities via Zoom. And, I will say on the professional level, I'm feeling Zoom fatigue. There's been tons of information about this in the mainstream media. I think for our children, and when I say children, I mean 6 years old through, 24. I think this is such a natural way for them to interact that we're even seeing, small dance parties via Zoom happen. Even things that may have been a sleepover party where everyone watched the same movie, parents creating that opportunity and connecting even with family members across the country in a way that probably wouldn't have happened before because they would have done a small in-person interaction in their home community. So those are some of the ideas. There's some additional ones on the PDF, but let's get to the exercise piece, because I think as a non-parent, I do my best when my nephews are in our home together, when we're all together, to get them exercising multiple times a day. In fact, sometimes they will say, must we go on another walk? Do we have to do another bike ride? But I do think for small children, and I think taking advantage of the weather, getting, my mom used to say, call it getting the uglies out. Actually, the picture on the left for me is actually pretty sentimental. It's not of my family, but my mom used to take us to something we called the Big Woods, which had a pond and a lake, and it was basically trails that you could hike, and we would spot frogs and other animals. We were always very into animals. I found that to be really soothing. I think for small children, what's interesting is, I've heard 3 families that have gotten bouncy houses for their kids as a way to let off steam. And I will say my nephews are among the families that have done this. My brother has reported that it's very hard to get them out of the bouncy house at the end of the day, and it's inflatable, so you can put it away. I just saw an article in the New York Times that indoor or outdoor above ground pools, it's very hard to even get them anymore because there's been such a rush on them from an inventory perspective. It's a non-traditional form of exercise, but I think, again, we have a bunch in the PDF of ideas, and given if it's a family that has some bandwidth, going back to some of the activities we did as kids, obstacle courses, those sack races. My mom, for a lot of our birthday parties, would have very creative ways for us to burn off energy with small prizes at the end. And so I think there are enormous opportunities for parents to take advantage of exercise over the summer. And I do, as much as I think families creating their own structure and routine that works for them is important, I do believe that daily exercise can be a really critical component of maintaining some sense of sanity within home. So if there was one activity, I would say you could leave off bonding one day, but do yourself a favor and include some form of getting outside whenever it's possible and exercise.
And I'm just going to call you out on a second, but one of the things I have loved about your stories is yours and your mom's willingness to try these various Zoom classes together and wind up laughing at some of the ridiculousness. And I love that.
That's exactly
Still
right.
exercise. Yeah.
I still consider myself a child. I mean, I'm 42, so not that young, but I will say, and I would imagine for small children, this has the same relevance. I have had my mom on Zumba classes, cardio dance classes, all of which are available on Amazon Prime. They actually have a little station called BeFit that you can sign up with. We've tried yoga classes, and sometimes I will say we are not afraid 30 minutes into the class to say this is too hard or this wasn't what we hoped for. We shut it off, we start something else, or we go out for a walk. But it's been a really fun bonding experience, and it's been hilarious. I wish, actually, I told my nephews we would tape ourselves doing one just so they could have some amusement.
That's great.
So we talked a little bit about altruism. I think there are some great websites that can give projects. I think, I do think there are opportunities even for small children to think through writing. You mentioned letters to grandparents, but letters to people who are overseas at wartime, letters to families who've lost loved ones for a variety, whether it's from COVID or some of the awful incidents that have happened across our country. I think there are shelters and animal rescue groups that are just starting to open up, at least in the Massachusetts area. So, fostering a pet or helping to gather donations. I know in my house, because I don't have children, I was able to reorganize every inch of my home, and a big portion of what I donated were old beds of dog beds, old collars. So kids creating campaigns via the internet with friends and family, gathering those things and dropping them off. And you can wear masks, it can be very safe. But again, this sort of, I think at very young ages, and we were blessed in my house to have parents who led by example, but my parents also were really open to us determining what areas are we interested in. So as a small child, I did some work with, and when I say small, I mean 5th grade. So pretty young, I started a charity club. We donated gift baskets that we made to a home it was called the Home for Little Wanderers. It was for foster care children. Then I volunteered in a nursing home in 6th grade. And then it progressed to other areas. Now I'm really active with animals. And I think if you can in my house, the rule was always, we will give you a lot of options. The option you can't pick is nothing. So pick something. And I think kids having some voice in where they volunteer their time, it's just a really great value for them to develop early on.
And you did raise a really good point. We don't have to dictate 100% what our kids do, what their passion is going to be, what their interest is going to be, what their purpose on any given day is going to be, but we do have to ask them to develop one.
Exactly.
Contribution, chores. chores.
This is always the exciting one.
It's one nobody likes to talk about. But let's look at it in a different way. I was talking to a family advisor not that long ago, and he said the first question he asks every member of the family is, what do you bring to the family? Not what do you get from your family, but what do you bring? And so we can do that in more than just concrete chore ways. We can do that in, I am the comic relief of my family. I am the person who likes to buy gifts for my family. I am the person who consoles the others. You know, we can look at the ways we bring contribution to a family system from all kinds of angles, some of which are going to be more practical, like chores, but those chores may be even better accepted if they feel like it goes with who they are and what their role is in the family.
I think it's a great point. And I had two creative solutions that I heard recently, both of which I thought were really helpful. So one actually was somebody who said, you know, the parents weren't particularly technologically savvy. So the children were the ones, and children, it was really like 16 to 20, were finding all these meal delivery solutions, both groceries and actually cooked meals during COVID, which if I consider myself pretty good at finding ways to get things delivered to my home. And this time has been very challenging. It's getting easier, but they were actually the ones who polled the family members, made the grocery list, downloaded the Instacart app, and the parents filled in the credit card information. But it saved the parents from having to worry about yet that next thing. So to your point, it was something that the child actually enjoyed doing because it felt like a contribution that was a pain for the parents. And the parents said, I don't want to have to toggle between all these different things, or it's telling me I can't get the delivery for 3 weeks. So I thought that was a good point. Another family mentioned to me, which I thought was really interesting, that they put on their headphones and they sort of designate one day a week, and I think it was a Saturday morning from 9 to 11. They get up, have a special breakfast, and then they have sort of a family chore time. But it wasn't this, it's not like the movies where everyone's high-fiving and throwing toilet paper rolls for each other. They actually all have noise-canceling headphones and either listen to music, podcasts, Audible, books on tape, but it's a time that they're sort of together and alone at the same time. And they're all working towards, they say, we dedicate 2 hours, we designate who does what, they rotate. Anybody who gets stuck with a chore that's a little bit less exciting, like the bathroom or something, gets an extra, a tip at the end of the week or whatever, or gets to pick what meal we're going to order for that evening. But it's a sort of a bonding activity so that the family members felt like they were contributing. And the last area, and I know, I would say there's a fine line between bribing children to do everything and making them feel like any little thing. I mean, I've seen this with some families where every time they pick up a fork, it's like, well, am I going to get a gold star for that? Am I going to get a piece of candy? So that, I don't know that you want to increase that dynamic, but I have a very good friend whose daughter wanted violin lessons, wanted to own a violin and to have the lessons provided. In my family, I will just own that, if we had a productive hobby that my parents thought was helpful, we just sort of got whatever it was. We got the violin lessons, provided that we had made a good case for why. Well, this mom, I thought it was a very creative solution, said that she had seen her daughter pick things up and put it down and heard other family members complain about spending a lot of money, time, and resources getting something and then the child not taking to it. So she told her that if for 1 month she could set the table every night without being prompted to do so, they would keep a calendar, she would earn her violin and her violin lessons. And the daughter was 5 years old. And it took her a year to earn her violin lessons. Now, I don't know if I would have had that discipline, just candidly, but I have to say, you could do a truncated version of that. And I think the best, I'll be honest, when her daughter came to visit my house with her mom, she brought the violin with her and was performing because she was so proud of having achieved this.
So, yeah, that's great.
Okay, so last slide, hobbies. I think, I would just say, the do-at-home projects, I think, that are available online are incredible. My brother's had his kids doing these sort of woodworking activities that are very inexpensive from Home Depot. The kids are excited because afterwards they make something. I think there are all sorts of things indoors that you can do, from Shutterfly book albums. I just made my mom a jigsaw puzzle. Jigsaw puzzles are very big in our house right now. But of all pictures of us as children. And I do think I'm hearing more and more families that are enjoying doing some of those activities together. And we've got a whole list of creative ideas on our PDF that we'll send out after this. Are there any things that you want to mention around hobbies, Diana?
I just think particularly when kids are young, the idea of making things is really important. You can get away with some really simple ingredients: flour, food coloring, and hot water. And you can basically make Play-Doh and use food coloring in glasses. Look at how this color makes this color. Anything that we do that involves color and texture and use of our hands is great for kids.
It's awesome. Okay. I think this is, so the last couple ideas that we have are around, thinking about maybe not individual prize incentives, like you do this and you're going to win a car or you're going to win some kind of electronic, but more experiences. So reinforcing, we're in this together as a family, and maybe setting up a system. Maybe it is, if you don't need to be prompted to do your chores, the family doesn't need to be prompted to do their chores for the week, that we as a family will do XYZ. We'll get food from our favorite restaurant. We will commit to doing an activity together, to going somewhere after COVID lifts, whatever the activity, whatever the item is that I think reinforces the experience of being together is an idea. We've got some information about some summer offerings that our company is putting out. And one of the items I wanted to just call out in our PDF that is out there, we found actually a free resource of a group that helps families. It is free, but they help vet summer experiences and camps, overnight camps for older kids. So we've added that to the list of resources. I talked to the owner yesterday and was really impressed. So I think that ends our content portion. It looks like we have a couple of questions, but we really want to thank everyone for participating. I know there's a lot of content out there, so we're really grateful to have an active group.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, we do have a couple questions. Some I'm going to kind of combine because they're along the same lines. We had somebody who was wondering about ideas for if you have kids that are going back and forth between mom and dad's house, or they're living with their grandparents during the summer or during the pandemic, and how to kind of structure their days, or for the parent to be the guiding person without offending grandparents, kind of paying attention to the different parenting styles.
That's a great question. And I do think that question, and in fact, those dynamics, are going to require real communication. So they're going to have to sit down like they are a family board and determine as the family what the rules, what the standards, because if one parent is enforcing them one way and the grandparents are enforcing them another way, all that can develop is conflict and resentment. So even if that family meeting is over Zoom or over email, if they're not civil enough to be able to talk directly, do the best to come up with the same set of ground rules.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I will say I have a friend in a similar situation, and I'll address the grandparents one first, but I think the same applies to mom and dad's house, being split. So on the grandparents, on both sides, I would say, I think exactly what you've said, determining, but I would say kind of going into it again with that good enough parenting philosophy. What are the 4 things that are really important to me, or the 6 things, hopefully not more than 10. But even if it can keep it to one hand, better. It's important that my kids get medication, if they need it every day. It's important that they exercise. It's important that they go to bed at a certain time, eat, figuring out for your children what are the most important things where you've seen them thrive that are crucial to their routine, and trying to keep the guidance specific to that, as opposed to And that, you know, I notice with some parents that we've worked with, particularly in intergenerational families, if the mother or the father is saying, well, they also need to eat organic broccoli and they only like this toy and we need to do this, it comes back to both educating the folks that are going to be taking care of them. These are really what's needed to meet their needs, but also having a conversation with your children. You're going to someone else's home. I know in my family, you know, we went to my mother's side of that family, and then we went to my dad's side of the family, and we were very much raised in an old school parenting philosophy. Nobody asked me, you know, would you like broccoli or carrots for dinner? You got what you got. And I had great parents, but they would at someone's home say, you know, things are going to be a little different. You may not have your own bed to sleep in. You may not have as many choices for snacks. And it's not, you're going to have to be able to manage your own expectations around that. If you're upset about it, you can come talk to us, but please don't bring that up to someone else. So I think it's both as parents projecting an attitude of these are the essential things for it to be a successful experience for my children, and talking about it that way with your loved ones, or your ex-partner or whatever the situation is, but saying like, these are the things I think are important, getting some consensus on that, but trying to keep it to a manageable list.
Small. I think the real important point was really cull that list down to the essence this summer.
Yeah.
If they swim in their pool, they may not need a bath later in the day. No, really, cull it down.
I think it's a great point. And I think even with the other piece, I would just point out on the logistical side, going between two homes or going to, you know, grandparents' house, you know, having children, you know, one of the best things I saw as a non-mom is being on a plane with a mom who had two small children rolling their own little mini suitcases, which were adorable. And she said to me, well, all the things that they need for this trip are in their little suitcase that they're rolling. And so you can extrapolate that to a bigger group. But sort of having kids sort of know that, you know, again, they're not necessarily going to have to bring everything that they had. I think making the summer a little bit simpler and saying, okay, what you need, you bring along with you and you're responsible for your belongings. So it's not, oh my gosh, they forgot this. And, you know, mom is trying to get it over to dad's house or whatever the situation is.
Any other questions, Sydney?
Yeah, we do. Can you talk a little bit about parents who have kids with special needs? You know, people who are out of district school or don't have the regular access to supports and resources that they generally would.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's going to take the village philosophy. I don't think it's going to be very possible for parents with special needs kids to think they can fulfill every single function that school systems were doing, that clinical care providers were doing without those people, and without getting some family involvement or best friend involvement, or even remote involvement, if that's possible for those kids. Yeah.
I'll add to it and say that I think, you know, we're doing a bit of respite support through our company. I do think there are other organizations and nonprofit and for-profits that are offering sort of in-home services even during the time of the pandemic. I think you're absolutely right, Diana, that there are an increasing amount of virtual offerings. And I am hearing that schools, you know, at least in Massachusetts, I talked to an autism service provider specifically, and he was mentioning that some of the schools are aware that they're going to have to be able to offer some supports over the summer. So I do think working with either an educational advocate or the school system to see if it's possible to get supports through, you know, from an outside organization, but that are funded through the school, you know, it might be present. I do think, you know, it takes a bit more vetting, but it can be a less expensive option if you go on something like care.com and you look for folks who have some special needs experience. I keep coming back to all the camps being closed, and depending on the level of need of the child, there may be folks who would have been camp counselors who are interested and have a specialty who may have worked at a therapeutic camp, but now are without a summer job and might have more opportunities to provide support in the home. It is a harder one.
Next question.
If you do have a question, feel free to chat it or chat it in the chat box or in the Q&A, and I think we have time for a couple more questions if anybody has any.
Diana, I'll ask you a question while we're waiting for the audience. Put you right on the spot. So, if you, just to speak very practically, if your son was, let's say, 8 years old, and this was, you are the mom facing this summer, thinking about all the obligations that you have and commitments that you have, what would be your approach? If you had to think through in an ideal situation how you would look at the summer, how would you deal with it? I'm thinking about, a more mature son being able to manage his own time. I think your philosophy was spot on. But if you were younger, kind of, how would you think about approaching a conversation and providing structure?
I would probably break the day down into segments, and I would be as organized as I possibly could. And this is going to sound ridiculous. I would get the materials together for the art segment later so that I wasn't necessarily at 8. They're capable of doing art by themselves as long as the materials are there. I would do a lot of material prep first thing in the morning and then have segments of potentially, then I'd go back to work and then maybe take a 10-minute break to go do some exercise outside. There are ways, but it's going to take a lot of organization. And frankly, I think it's going to probably involve more screen time than we would have wanted. By and large, we would have wanted our kids to be able to be as free from screen and in camps doing these things. And that's not likely to be possible. That's going to be part of the good enough acceptance this summer, is that we will have more screen in all likelihood.
That was one of my next question was going to be, how do you avoid it becoming the summer of video games, particularly if you live in a community where the weather isn't always consistently great, or it's very warm and you don't have a lot of options. So you answered that question.
It's going to be hard. But you know what? My neighbors, I noticed, who had last week when we had summer, because that was it. It's now 45 again. They took their old presentation screen and a projector, and they did an outdoor movie theater. And I thought, what a great idea. They didn't have to rent equipment. They just used their equipment, and they were all out there with their lawn chairs and some speakers. And that's a pretty humble way of promoting an activity in the evening that could be fun.
Have you heard of any ways that parents can promote reading amongst, younger children or older children? How do you develop a culture around maybe, encouraging this to be the summer of books, which for me would be as exciting, but at that age, as a child.
No, it isn't. First of all, you include them in the picking of books. Even little kids love the Scholastic catalog back in elementary school where you got to pick the books. Pick the books. Don't make it, we're reading this summer. Model it. Read and laugh about what you're reading. Be in a book and start laughing. Make it an enticing thing, potentially, and then do reading before bed. Read, read, read. Poems, jokes, doesn't matter. Books of nastiness, yeah.
I've heard of actually some parents who said they deliberately chose books where there were mainstream movies that have been published because the hook they got was, okay, we read the Harry Potter book and then we'll watch the movie. And it got the kids more engaged, and they had a whole theme around, they really blew it up and made it a whole theme around parties and gifts associated with it. But the idea was to sort of use something as the platform to gauge some interest, especially with kids who, are maybe not as confident in their own reading skills. What do you do? What would you suggest for parents around self-care? What would you, if you're a parent and you're going through and you're structuring your day with your segments and you're looking at it and saying, I have 0 minutes to myself, but we all know that the burnout is going to happen if you don't take some. How would you talk about prioritizing and other specific self-care tips that you would say are important for parents to be thinking about this summer?
The minute you said that, all I could think of is kids was the brush the teeth, brush the hair, and scoot out of the bathroom, and that's called self-care. I think really the need to schedule it in, to put that not as the lowest priority on the schedule. Put it in, get up 15 minutes earlier than your kids if you possibly can. Allow your kids to have cartoons for the first 15 minutes so you can take that 15 minutes of, oh my God. And the last thing I say is really develop a way to let yourself off the hook that night. I used to have the prayer, dear God, please help all make it through the night so I can apologize for what I did today. It is really, we are all going to have to acknowledge, be forgiving of other people and ourselves.
I think it's a great point. All right, I have one last question because I still don't see any on the chat.
Okay.
If you are a parent of a child with a mental health or a substance abuse issue, what are things you would be thinking about this summer, given some of the limitations of the way we can be together? We know that residential programs are accepting people, wilderness for sure, but we also know there's still a lot being offered, telehealth that would have traditionally been in a hospital setting in a more structured way. What are things you would be thinking about as a parent?
I would be thinking, not that there are virtual AA meetings, NA meetings, and not that those aren't good, but again, opening that bubble up so that the individual with substance disorder can get some healthy supports in a one-to-one kind of way. That would be my first. For somebody in recovery, they're going to need actual face-to-face support, I believe. And while substance use disorders and other mental health crises survive in isolation, we can be the people who say, no, you can't stay in that room for 9 hours today smoking that weed. Come on, let's go for a walk.
All right, we did have another question, which I think is a great one. How do you teach kids that parents need to take time for themselves also?
You do it.
Well, what is the communication?
If you don't do it, they never learn it. I had a timer. I had one of those classic kitchen timers, which has come in handy for every inch of parenting, because I used to be able to say the timer says it's time for mommy to take 10 minutes, or I am really not doing as well as I would like to right now. I need to put mommy in a timeout. Take the time, model for your kids that you need it. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, set the timer. Tell them they're not allowed to darken the door until that timer chings. Take it. And they won't let you take it initially. You're going to have to. They're going to be scratching at the door, clamoring, Mommy! And you're still going to have to let it happen.
It's a good time to give them some additional screen time. Give them something they like. That's what I've often heard. That is the time for the lollipop or whatever the treat is of the day.
Yes.
Well, I think we're at time and I don't see any additional questions. Anything else you wanted to add, Diana, or any other issues you want to?
No, thank you guys. Just be gentle with yourselves and your families.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for participating. Thank you, Sydney. And we will send out the PDF for everyone who's been on the webinar. We really appreciate it.